So we left off talking about our SIP call flow. So we are kind of coming back in to our session here to pick up our configuration of our endpoints. And as we've gone so far, we basically said, hey, this is a 3-step process. We need to configure the account in Asterisk. We did that in sip.conf. We need to configure some type of way to dial the phone. We did that in extensions.conf through that one line of Dialplan script. That was pretty cool. And now we need to actually configure the endpoint. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the various methods by which you can do endpoint configuration. So the first is manual configuration. And this is typically done through the phone's actual interface or through a web GUI that's served from the phone as a web server. So this is somewhat tedious. I don't know if you guys have done a lot of try to do manual configuration. If you go onto a phone and try to navigate through the phone's menus, you can certainly tell the phone, here's your IP, or here's your DHCP server, or here's your DNS credentials, or it can get that stuff through DHCP, but here's your username and here's your password, right? You can log into the phone and do that. A little bit nicer is typically if you go to the IP address of the phone, once it's gotten a DHCP address, you can go to the phone's web GUI. And so you can typically configure a phone manually, tell it what its authentication credentials are, and maybe configure the line label, some other things like that. And those are common ways when you have a couple phones, hey, I can do manual configuration. What's probably more popular is, hey, I need to deploy 100 phones or 1,000 phones all at one time. And the way that's typically done is through DHCP option 66. So the way DHCP option 66 is when the phone boots up and it queries a DHCP server to say, hey, give me my IP address. In addition to its IP address, it gives it a boot server information. And so in this case, it's going to say, oh, but I also want a boot server information. So it's going to go over to the boot server and say, what's my configuration? So typically these configuration files, they're stored in an XML format. And that XML, the phone will download the XML and automatically download its configuration. So you can see this is nice at scale when I need to configure 1,000 phones at once or 100 phones at once. This is nice to be able to have that. The downfall of it is, of course, I need to make sure my DHCP server is configured properly. I need to make sure that I have like an FTP server or TFTP server or FTPS. I need to configure those protocols. Something's got to serve it to the phone. And of course, I've got to generate the XML. Of course, sometimes there's a lot of tools that will generate that XML for you, and sometimes not. And depending on how good the tool is, you got to generate that XML to get it on the phone. So both of those options will work with Digium phones. You can configure the phone manually from the interface. You can configure the phone manually from a web GUI. You can configure XML and serve it to the phone via FTP, and it'll get its configuration that way as well. But what is unique and kind of cool about Digium phones also is that Digium phones can be auto-configured via resdigiumphone.conf, which we call the Digium phone module for Asterisk, or DPMA. So I'm actually just kind of curious, has anyone seen the video how to configure Digium phones with DPMA, if anybody see that on YouTube? One person. Awesome, thanks. Well, if that video is probably going to go a little bit more deep than I'll go today, but I also did that video, so that's why I talk about it. In any case, I'll show you guys some of this basic configuration. So the nice thing about DPMA is when our engineers at Digium got together, they said, we want to design a phone that's designed specifically for Asterisk. And again, kind of like I said about our cards, like I said about our PBX, there are a lot of phone vendors here. So as long as you guys promise not to tell Digium marketing that I was saying everybody else's products are good too, everybody else's products are good too. There's a lot of vendors here. I encourage you to check out their booths too. Of course, I personally feel that Digium phones are the best. So, and I'm the most familiar with them. So as we talk about endpoint configuration, I'll show you how the Digium phones work. So our engineering team got together. They said, we want phones that are specifically built for Asterisk. So Asterisk works with almost any SIP-compliant endpoint, which is part of the power of Asterisk, is you're not locked into a proprietary endpoint. It's not like if I've got Avaya, I need the Avaya endpoints. If I've got Cisco, I need the Cisco endpoints. Asterisk will work with any SIP endpoint because it uses SIP as an open standard. Of course, if you want advanced features, if you want, for example, to get your voicemail on your phone, if you want to get what they call like visual voicemail or dynamic voicemail actually on the phone, or if you want special features like being able to have like a contacts application on the phone or be able to do status on the phone, for those types of advanced features, you need tight integration between the endpoint and the PBX. So our developers developed Digium phones. They're not OEM phones. A lot of people ask me, they're saying like, oh, these are just Polycom phones rebranded. No, these are actually, Digium actually engineered their own phones. These are our phones from the ground up, engineered, and they're specifically built to work with Asterisk. One of our goals was we wanted it to be easy to configure. We wanted it to be super simple to be able to get the configuration on the phones. Don't need to mess with XML. Don't need to mess with those kind of servers. We've got the Digium phone module for Asterisk. The way the Digium phone module for Asterisk works is it uses MDNS. And so MDNS is multicast DNS. Multicast DNS, if you guys are familiar with like Avahi, is kind of the Linux flavor. They also call it ZeroConf. Or on Apple, if you have an Apple computer, if you've ever used like Bonjour, and so typically like on an Apple computer, it boots up and it kind of knows where all the printers are. Same kind of technology, MDNS. The way MDNS works is when the phone comes up on the network and the server comes up on the network with DPMA, they send out an MDNS message, it's multicast DNS, and they say, hey, here's my IP address. And this one says, hey, here's my IP address. And without any configuration at all, I haven't even touched the phone yet. All I've done is plugged it in. It knows where the Asterisk server is, and the Asterisk server knows where it is. So it like auto magically does that via MDNS. We did have a question. I don't think so. I don't think there's like a timeout, like a SIP registration. It'll do that anytime you reconfigure the phone. I'm pretty sure. The question was how often does it query via MDNS? And that's a good question. I don't know the particular answer, but it's typically when it boots. But you can actually force a reconfiguration. The idea is the phone boots up, it knows where the server is automatically, and then it says, hey, I want to get my configuration. And the way you configure the phone, rather than XML, is actually in a text-based .conf file, the same way we've talked about everything else so far today. So this is what resdigiumphone.conf looks like. You can see it's very familiar. We have square brackets. We've got key value pairs. Semicolon is the comment operator. So this is all very familiar to an Asterisk administrator. If you know how to configure sip.conf, if you know how to configure extensions.conf, you are going to be very familiar with how to configure resdigiumphone.conf. So what do I want to specify? Well, I want to be able to specify a phone, and I want to be able to specify lines, right? So in this case, on this phone, I have 6 line keys, which means I can have 6 different accounts, 6 different SIP accounts that can make calls and make to and from this phone. So what I need to do is have a configuration for the phone, and that is where you see here type equals phone. This is the phone configuration. And then for every line on the phone, I want to have a line configuration. And so you see here I have line equals SIP account name, and this matches the type equals line section here, the SIP account name. And that's exactly what it is. That name is going to be the same exact name that we put in sip.conf. So in this case, I've created a phone here. This is for a fictitious character. His name is Alan Dorner. He's kind of like our marketing name that we use in marketing. And so I've created an account for Alan Dorner, and I've called his account A Dorner. So in sip.conf, I have an account for A Dorner. And then in resdigiumphone.conf, I have a type equals phone and set that line to A Dorner. Additionally, for each line, I can set a line section, and there I can configure some things that are particular to the phone that I wouldn't necessarily configure in sip.conf, things like the line label or the extension number. I'll show you what this looks like over here on my terminal. So here in resdigiumphone.conf, we have a general section at the top. And this is kind of similar to, like I said, any other .conf file that has a general section. And there are a couple options you can configure. User list auth, config auth. I'll talk about these in a moment. I want to kind of get down to the phone configuration here, right? So this is the actual configuration. I've got an account. I've called this one Alan D70 because it's for Alan's D70 phone. I've configured a network for the phone. So for some enterprises, you might have one network. All your phones are going to be on one network. But if you happen to have multiple VLANs or different network infrastructures, and you want to serve different registration servers, you want phones on different networks to register to different servers, you're able to manage that through a network. So I've just got one network. I've called it network 1. Okay? This one has a type equals phone. So this is very similar to sip.conf. In sip.conf, we had type equals friend, type equals user, or type equals peer. Here in resdigiumphone.conf, we have type equals phone or type equals line. The phone section is for the phone, right? So I can configure some other things like the full name. The full name is what is going to pop up when I configure the phone. So when the phone queries for a configuration, there's a couple of different ways that it can do it. One way is it'll say, well, just send me a list of all the configurations available. And then it'll send me a list of all the phones. And right there on the screen, I'll see, oh, here's a line for Alan Dorner. Here's one for Ryan Fergus. Here's one for Mitch Conley. And I can pick my name out of the list. And when I pick my name, it configures my phone for me. So that's why I configure the full name there. And then, of course, I said the line is for A. Dorner. That is going to match the sip.conf, which I'll show you guys here. The sip.conf configuration is, actually, that's probably good. So right up here in the top section of the screen is sip.conf, and there's the configuration in sip.conf. So I've got an account called A. Dorner, type equals friend, host equals dynamic, context equals internal underscore phones, set as secure SIP secret. I've given it a mailbox, and I'll talk about that later on when I talk about voicemail. And then I've set some codec options here so that it's using a HD codec. So you can see that this name here, highlighted in yellow, matches the resdigiumphone.conf on the bottom of the screen with the line equals. I can also set a contact directory, which I've set on my phone. Here's the line settings, and actually these ones were just experimental. That's the correct line settings there. So there we go. It's a pretty simple configuration. And then I would go into Asterisk. If you guys are doing fastest due to the dial tone tomorrow, I'll give you guys a heads up so that you can win that iPad. You're going to do a SIP reload, right? SIP reload's going to read in my SIP configuration. So I put in that SIP account, right? Now I want to reload the Digium phone module for Asterisk, right? So I can do module reload res digiumphone.so. And in fact, during the contest tomorrow, you don't even need to do that because I've set it up for you. Okay? Now what I want to do is I want to tell the phone, hey, you've got some new information, right? Which is really nice. I can also do that from the command line. I can do Digium phones reconfigure. And in this case, I could reconfigure specific phones. I'll just do a reconfigure all. And the screen's a little small, but perhaps you can see that as soon as I issued that command, on the screen it's like, hey, I'm going to go fetch my new configuration. Of course, on the CLI, you can see it's sending a bunch of data because it's the phones and Asterisk are talking back and forth to each other. So, I mean, really, that's it. It's automatically gotten its configuration, and it's basically done there. So the phones have gotten its configuration. Yeah, we have a question over here.
How does which phone then knows which one it should come over?
OK. Yes, this is an excellent question. So the question is, how does this phone know that it's Alan Dorner's phone except this phone? OK. There are a couple ways that you can denote that. So, and actually I said I would talk about this, so I'm very glad you asked that question because I forgot to talk about it. In any case, up here at the top in the general section, you have a couple options. So, like I said, when the phone boots up, if I just disable the user list auth configuration, and I disable the config auth configuration, right? What'll happen is when the phone boots up, there's no authentications configured. So when the phone boots up, it's just going to receive a list. It's going to say, hey, pick your configuration server. And if you have multiple servers, you can pick which one you want. Or if you only have one, it'll time out in 5 seconds. It'll automatically pick that one. It'll query the server. Of course, this all happens, like I said, MDNS automatically. And it'll present to you a list of names. And so I configured that full name, Alan Dorner. So from that list of names, I can pick the name out. And I can tell this phone, hey, you are Alan Dorner. And so once I pick that name, the phone knows who it is. On subsequent reconfigures, it'll always grab that account. Okay? So that's one way you can do it. This is kind of nice. If you have an office of, like, say, 10 people, this kind of speeds up your installs. The idea is I don't want to have to know who's at what location. I just want to, like, hand out a bunch of phones and basically say, pick your name out of the list. And they can pick their name out of the list. Bam, their phone's configured. That's kind of the idea there. Another way you can do it is instead of config auth, you can do MAC, authentication via MAC address. And of course, down here in the section, I have the MAC address. So now I've set configuration for MAC address. I've set a MAC address for that phone. Now when the phone boots up, it queries the server. The server says, oh, I have a bunch of configurations, but I'm set for MAC authentication. What's your MAC address? The phone says, hey, here's my MAC address. And Astra says, oh, I have a configuration for you. And it spits that configuration to the phone. The user and nobody needs to touch it at all. This is very similar to what you would do via, like, DHCP and FTP and XML. Just you configure it via MAC address. The last kind of way you can do it, or one of the other options, there's a couple different ways to configure it. So for example, you can do configuration via pin method. So for example, the phone boots up. It gets the list of users. I'm going to pick a user out of the list, but I need to type in the voicemail pin before I can download that configuration, right? So I want people to be able to pick their name out of the list, but I don't just want anybody to be able to pick any phone. You can do that kind of configuration. Or you can also do even like a global pin. And what this means is when the phone comes online and it goes to grab the list of configurations, it says, hey, before I'll give you the list of configurations, you need to enter in the PIN number. So there's a lot of configuration. You can lock it down really tight. You can make it, enter a PIN in order to configure and do all that. Or you can keep it open, kind of depending on what your needs. I like the MAC address authentication because it pops up, it knows its MAC address, and it goes for it. That's correct. So let's say I had 100 phones, right? And the phone comes online, and I have 100 accounts. I've got I would call it like a phone profile. It's got a list of 100 phone profiles. And so you would say, yeah, I don't want to scroll through 100 things to find my name. The idea is actually it's really cool. So for example, and this is where I'm lamenting. I normally bring a camera, and I'll show you guys the phone screen. And unfortunately, my FireWire cable died on me like right before I came to the conference. So I'm just, if you will imagine in your imaginations, and I'll tell you how it works. So the idea is you come online, it has a list of like 100 names, right? You want to pick your name. So I want to pick Billy Chia out of a list of 100 names. Well, what's really cool is, first of all, I can do it by extension number. So if I know that my extension number is 699, if I type 699, it auto-filters it, and it cuts all the cruft, and just my name will appear, right? The other way I can filter it is on my first name or my last name. So if you look at like a DTMF keypad, let's say I wanted to do Chia, right? That's my last name. It's CHIA. It's just like a Chia Pet, which has been like the butt of jokes since junior high. So C is like the number 2, and then H is number 4, and then I is number 4, so I'd hit 2, 4, 4. So if I hit 2, 4, 4, it's going to filter not only on extension 244, but also the name Chia. And it automatically figures that out. So it's really cool. You can filter through a list very quickly by just picking the letters that you want, and it'll auto-filter it for you.
So multiple extensions might end up with the same extension. In other words, if you register Chia here, you have 2 extensions that are registered to you.
Right. So the question is, if I've got 2 phones, they come online at the same time, and they're both trying to grab the config, which one gets it? And the answer is the first person there, the first person to the finish line. So what happens is when the phone boots up, it will only present to you the unconfigured phones. You can go to an additional screen and say, give me the configured phones, and then steal it from the other one, right? But that's essentially what happens. And it's not quite hot desking. We don't say, hey, this is hot desking. It's not quite like that. But I can take this phone, and I can pick Alan Dorner's account, and now this one's configured for Alan Dorner. If I then go over to this phone, and I configure this one for Alan Dorner, it'll steal the account. So the kind of idea is like, if I've got this phone at the office and this phone at home, when I get home, I can reconfigure this phone. It'll pull the configuration, and now this one is just like my desk phone. It's stolen it from this one. Of course, an issue if you have open authentication and let everybody get whatever they want. But that's kind of the idea, is the first person there gets the account, and once that account is used, or once that phone profile is used, then it doesn't show up in the list by default. You have to go over to the use config. We had another question here.
If you have a phone that's already been configured, and now that person is left, and you have a new person coming in, can you configure that phone without having to do a wipe on the phone?
Yes. So I need to think for a moment about the type of data that, for the most part, yes. And I'll answer it at a very technical level. So, or not at a very technical level, but at an exacting level. So the Digium phones allow you to store a local phone book, right? So if you go into the phone, you can locally add your own contacts. It's a little bit tedious. You have to do it through the phone's interface, but you're able to do that. Most people aren't going to do that because most people are going to want the XML contacts file that you can just serve to them nicely, and this is how you kind of see the names pop up here. I did that all. I just served it the XML file. But it is possible for someone to configure a phone contact thing. And the last I heard, I don't know if it's on the bug tracker. I can't remember. The last I heard, if you have to physically reset the phone to start. So if they have a contacts list on there, you have to go to the phone and say, refresh to your default config. But barring that, if they haven't gone in and manually through the buttons configured contacts on the phone, then yeah, all it really takes is you update the file, you save the file, you say Digium phones reconfigure phone, and then that particular phone, and that phone sucks in its new config, and everything is fresh. The only thing it doesn't do is that local contacts file. So there we go. It's kind of steps 1, 2, 3. We set up an account on Asterisk. We created an extension to dial the account, and we configured the endpoint to match. And we've kind of already taken some questions, but if there's any other questions, I can take those too. All right. We are making pretty good time. So we will hop now into the interactive dial plan. So we've got a phone configured. We've learned a little bit of our dial plan scripting. Now, for the rest of our session today until 4 o'clock, we'll look at, we'll probably take a break in there in just a little bit. And for the rest of our session, we're going to be digging into the Dialplan, and we'll just basically be doing Dialplan scripting for the rest of the day. So I'll show you, well, I guess that's not totally the case. I'll show you how to do voicemail too, I think, in this next session. In fact, that's what we'll look at right now. We'll look at how to use a few more Dialplan applications. We'll make an IVR voice menu, and we'll implement voicemail. That's kind of what we'll do in this next session here. So let's talk about the basics of an IVR. I've kind of been using this term all day. Some of you guys know exactly what an IVR is. Maybe if you're new to the scene or you come from a different background, not a telephony background, you might be saying, hey, what the heck's an IVR? IVR stands for Interactive Voice Response. And this is going to take input from the caller, and usually that's in the form of DTMF or voice input, right? And then it's going to return a result, and this can commonly be from a database. So I'll give you an example. You call into a phone system for your bank, and it says, please enter your account number, and you enter your account number. And it says, please enter your PIN number, and you enter your PIN number to authenticate. And then it says, press 1 for your balance, press 2 for some other options, and you press 1. It queries the database, it finds out how much money you have in the bank, and then it reads back to you. It says, you have this much money in the bank. That's basically like an IVR system. We also have something called an auto attendant. An auto attendant is a very similar notion, but an auto attendant is a very simple IVR. So an auto attendant is typically used like for call routing. It typically is going to play you a message and take some DTMF input and then route the call. Now, if you come from the old school days of the telco, in the old school days of the telco, you know, maybe you really differentiated between, there's a big difference between an IVR and an auto attendant. And that's because in the old days, an IVR was a very expensive thing, and it was very, you know, cost a lot of money to implement. And the auto attendant would tend to be cheaper because it's a simpler deal. Well, in Asterisk, they're really the same thing. You really configure them almost the same way. So we just call an IVR an auto attendant and an auto attendant an IVR. And you'll find that within the Asterisk and the VoIP community that those terms are used interchangeably, regardless of whether that's accurate or not. So let's take a look at what an IVR would look like. And here is the Dialplan example, and I'll walk it through for you step by step. This is in extensions.conf, so we're back in the Dialplan. And the first thing to note about this IVR configuration is that it's just a context. If you guys remember earlier, I said one of the reasons you would configure a separate context is to host an IVR. So we put our IVR menu inside of a context, and we're going to put our scripts in there, right? Now, the first thing we want to do when we hop into our IVR, actually, let me talk about so I've called this context AA menu. That's what I've called it. And you'll notice that the extension is S, okay? So if you guys remember earlier, I said extensions, you could have extension 100. You could name an extension script like 100 or 777 or whatever number, but you can also give it a name. You could call it dial or IVR. There are some names of extensions that are reserved for special purposes, okay? We call these special extensions, and there's several of them. One of them is the S extension, okay? S stands for start, and it has a special function. Basically, special extensions are extensions that calls will be routed to automatically given a certain condition. So given a certain condition, the call is automatically going to go to a certain extension, okay? In this case, the S extension, any call that ends up in a context without DID information will route to the S extension, okay? So any call that enters a context and does not have DID information, and you would say, well, if I call 100, how does it not have DID information, right? When is this ever going to happen? Well, the answer is it's always going to happen on an FXO trunk or an FXO line. An FXO would mean like an analog phone line that you have like to the telephone company. So imagine this, like your 100-year-old technology, like analog phone that you have at your house, or maybe you probably don't anymore. You probably got rid of it about 7 years ago when you got a cell phone. But if you happen to have seen one of these things in your lifetime, they have these things called analog phones, and there's just a phone cable that connects into the wall. Well, if you think about it like this, when the telephone company sends a call to your home, does it send you digits? Does it send you like extensions? No. It just sends you a call. It's like you just get a call and it rings your phone. And in fact, it'll probably ring all the phones in the house at once because they're all on that same line, right? So what happens if I unplug that line from the phone and I plug it into a phone card, like a Digium phone card on my Asterisk server? Well, now that call is coming in from the telco and it's just plopped into the Asterisk server. Now I can direct it to a context the same way I do in sip.conf. In chandati.conf, I can tell it what context to start in. So I could say, well, go ahead and start in the auto attendant menu context, in the AA menu context. But once it gets there, it doesn't have any routing information because it's just come over an FXO trunk, right? So what will happen is if the call shows up, it's got no DID information, it'll start at the S extension. It'll just automatically get routed there. As a result, a best practice is to start your IVRs with the S extension. It's certainly not necessary, especially if it's like a VoIP-only PBX and you don't have analog lines, but it's a convention that you can use. While we're on the topic of special extensions, I'll go through the IVR a little bit more, and I'll talk more about some of the other special extensions. There's a few other ones in this IVR, and then when I'm done talking about the IVR, I'll share about some other ones. So we arrive at the S extension either by directly routing there, and I'll show you guys what that looks like. It would be like this. So if I open extensions.conf, I would have an extension that looks like this. So you can see extension 800 is using that go-to application that we talked about earlier today, and it's going to go to a context, extension, and priority. So the context is IVR, the extension is S, and the priority is 1, right? So this is basically saying if I call 800 from my phone, it's going to route to that IVR context. Note that this this extension is in the, right here, internal_phones context, okay? So if you remember our SIP configuration, I configured the phone to say when calls come in from the phone, they should enter into the internal_phones context. That's where it starts, right? But now I want to go to a different context. I want to go to the IVR context. In that case, I can go to extension 800 here, which is in the internal_phones context. That means my phone can access it, and it's going to route as a go-to over to the IVR context. That's how that call would get over there. So the first thing I want to do is I want to answer the channel, okay? The reason I want to answer the channel is so that I can pass media on that channel. It's also for billing purposes. So if you're keeping track of billing via like a CDR, like a call detail record, if a channel's not answered, which would be the case if, like, let's say the channel was ringing, I don't want to bill people for the time that the phone's ringing, right? But once the call is picked up, once I lift the receiver, or once I call the answer application and answer that channel, then I'm going to start billing that channel, right? And in this case, once the channel is answered, then it's ready to pass media, okay? There's another way to do that, to pass media on an unanswered channel. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, of course, now I want to pass that media. The way that I pass that media is by using the background application. Now, the background application simply plays an audio file, and it listens for DTMF input. By DTMF input, that stands for dual tone multi-frequency. That's basically the keys on your keypad. When you push a key on the keypad, that's what sends DTMF tones, right? So background is going to listen for those tones, and it's going to route to the first unambiguous extension it meets, okay? This is what I mean. You can see I have several other extensions. So this is all the S extension. Then I've got these other extensions, 1, 2, 3, and 0. Now, let's say I had both extension 1 and extension 100. And the background application plays a file. In this case, it's the main menu file, which is Allison saying main menu. And then I press the 1 key. Then it's not going to route immediately. It's going to wait a moment. The reason it's going to wait is because it doesn't know. Do you want extension 1 or do you want extension 100? It's not unambiguous. If you reach the timeout, which we call the interdigit timeout, it's about 5 seconds by default, but you can configure that. After 5 seconds, it'll go ahead and route to the extension 1. If you enter more digits, then you can route to extension 100. On the other hand, if I only have extension 2 and I have no other extensions to start with a 2, if I hit 2, as soon as I hit the 2, then it will route there. So sometimes you guys may have experienced this in your enterprise or in your local hosting. You have some people that call in, and they say, when I call into the IVR, I push the button. It doesn't route there right away. Sometimes it goes there right away. Sometimes it waits a moment. The reason it does that is because it needs to be an unambiguous match, right? As a best practice, something I would recommend to you guys is, depending on the size of your enterprise, I tend to start my extensions at like 6,000 or maybe even 7,000. So start my extensions starting with 7, and then that way, the likelihood of having an IVR menu that has 7 options on it is slim. If you've got that many options on your IVR, maybe you need to break it up anyway. But the point is that way you're saving yourself from that unambiguous input. If you press options 1 through 6, it's going to route immediately. And if they start with 7, then you know they're dialing an extension anyway.
Is there a way of expediting that? So I can stall an account or something like that to pass that timeout?
That's a good question. And I think that the background application, I don't believe, has that type of functionality. What you can do is use the read application, which I think does have that type of functionality, where you can essentially hit pound to say it's kind of like an enter, right? And so the difference would be is you'd be collecting DTMF tones and writing it to a variable and then routing based on that variable, whereas background collects the DTMF tones and immediately routes to that extension, or immediately as soon as it has an unambiguous input. But that's a good question. I'll repeat the question. And the question was, can I bypass the timeout by pressing the pound key? And I'm sure enough to say, I'm not totally sure, but I'm sure enough to say you can do that with the read application that I won't actually pull it up on the CLI. So. You can. So, for example, so the question is, can you make pound one of your menus? And you may have that as well. So you might have a menu where it says, press star to listen to these options again, or pound to exit. So you may not want to use pound because pound is like or we call it pound. That's not used globally. Sometimes it's called hash or the number sign. If you're using hash, that you might actually want that as a menu option. And so that's true as well. You could do that. But the menu option is going to be an extension. It's going to route to that extension. So in any case. And you can also shorten the timeout. You can use the timeout function, and we'll talk about that in the next session to shorten that timeout. In any case, it plays an audio file. It detects a DTMF tone. It routes to the first unambiguous input. And then additionally, I'm calling the wait extend application. The wait extend application works the same way as background, except that it doesn't play an audio file. So it listens for DTMF. And it's going to listen for DTMF for the length of time that you configure it to. So in this case, 5 seconds. So I'm giving the callers an extra 5 seconds to be able to enter a number, right? I don't just want to play the audio file and just give them that time. I want to give them a little bit extra time. So they enter it in, and then it routes. Now, this is what I talk about, the power of the Dialplan. Even if you haven't done a lot of scripting, how easy it is to add some pretty advanced functionality. So do you want to route a call into a call queue? Well, it's really as simple as calling the queue application and giving it the name of a queue that you configure in queues.conf. So in queues.conf, I have a queue called sales and a queue called support. And that's all I need to do to route to those queues. Now, there are some more options. You can do core show application queue and learn about some of the other options you can pass to it. But at a very basic level, that's how you can call it. The directory application. The directory application is a built-in application that takes the data that you've put in voicemail.conf. So we'll look at voicemail.conf in a moment. It takes whatever voicemail users you've configured, and it automatically puts them into a dial by name directory. So it'll say, enter the last 3 digits of the party you'd like to reach. You can enter in, or the last 3 characters. You can enter in their numbers, their letters of their name via DTMF tones. And it'll say, oh, we have this person. Would you like to route the call to them? And you can route to the call. Dial by name directory. It's really as simple as I have extension 3, priority 1. I call the directory application, right? Of course, as a best practice, it's good to have an option 0 and route that to an operator phone. And I'll show you guys one more application here, which I don't know if I have. I am pretty sure I can double check, but the question is, can I have multiple directories, or am I just locked down to one? And I'm pretty sure, I know for a fact in voicemail.conf you can configure multiple voicemail contexts. And so with each of those contexts can have different voicemail boxes. Essentially, if you're doing multi-tenant, you can have different contexts for different voicemail boxes. And I'm 99% sure that in the directory application, core show application directory, that you could specify a context. And so if you specify here the voicemail context, it'll just be the directory for that context. So you have company A, company B, done. So last one I'll show you here is core show application meet me. Now, actually, yeah, I'll show you guys. Oh, look at that. I don't even have it because it's Asterisk State certified. Conf. Do I have conf bridges? Oh, OK. Well, I actually have not loaded on my machine. I didn't compile any modules for any conference rooms. So apparently I don't have any conference rooms on my PBX. But the point is there's two conference room applications with an asterisk. Meet Me is the older style. So if you're on like an older box, Meet Me conferencing, it has some limitations in that it uses DOTI for timing. And so it's limited to G711 as a codec because of the timing source that it does. With Asterisk 10 and beyond, and in Asterisk 8, it has another application called ConfBridge. ConfBridge is in Asterisk 8. It's not the full ConfBridge. It's basically got like a whole new redesign for Asterisk 10. So Asterisk 10, Asterisk 11, going forward, has a conferencing application called ConfBridge. And ConfBridge is not dependent on DOTI timing. Therefore, it allows you to use wideband codecs in your conferencing. And it's the same kind of notion here that you guys see on the slide. You just call ConfBridge. It's with one application, you can dump callers into a conference bridge. It's really not that difficult to script that. You would just have another option, extend equals greater than option 4, and route them off to ConfBridge using the ConfBridge application. So let's take a short break. Let me look at my schedule here of kind of how we're running on. 2:30. We'll come back at 2:30. No. It is 2:30. We'll continue on in our IVR here, and of course it's mid-afternoon. It's time for a Red Bull. Okay, so we kind of discussed our routing here. So I've gotten into my IVR. The background extension is going to listen to DTMF tones, and it's going to route to extensions. And do we have a question?
Yeah, if you don't mind. You mentioned background will play a message and wait for DTMF. And you also mentioned that you can also prompt for voice recognition. What is involved with voice recognition?
So with voice recognition, you really want to use a plugin. And so built into the Asterisk engine is the ability to recognize DTMF tones. Of course, third-party solutions allow you to do voice recognition. So two of the guys that are probably here are Vestec and LumenVox. And so if you check out those guys, I think both of them have a voice recognition solutions to plug into Asterisk. And that'd be like a third-party plugin, and you get to pay an economical fee, and that would allow voice plugin. So the question was, how do I do voice recognition? And the answer is via third-party plugin, like Lumenvox. And we have another question over here. Res speech. So the question is, what about using res speech? Res speech would really be more like if you kind of wanted to develop your own speech recognition application, and you could use res speech to do so. That's probably a good summary statement on that. So it's probably more complex than that, but it's not like auto speech recognition now. Yeah. So the question was like, hey, if I use res speech, is that, hey, do I automatically have speech recognition? No, res speech is like a series of tools that you can use to kind of develop that, in a simplified manner. So let's talk about a few more special extensions, okay? So in our IVR, you've also noticed here that I have the I extension and I have the T extension, okay? So what happens in my IVR if I go to the background application and I listen to DTMF and I've got options 1, 2, 3, and 0, what if I press 4? What happens? Well, it's invalid input, right? There is no extension 4. There's no extensions that start with 4. So it's going to route to the I extension. So remember, I told you special extensions are extensions that get routed to under certain conditions. So the I extension gets routed to when you pass invalid input to a Dialplan application that's listening for DTMF, such as wait extend or background or read. Now, what happens also if the wait extend exhausts all 5 of its seconds and I don't implement anything? Let's say I call into the IVR and it says, hey, welcome to the main menu. Press 1 for sales, press 2 for support, all this kind of stuff. Take your pick. And it just waits there. It just times out. Well, then it's going to route to the lowercase t extension. That's the timeout extension. If nobody inputs any information in that time, then we route to the t extension. And you can see for the purposes of this IVR that I'm giving them another shot, essentially. So if they fat finger it and they press 4 and they meant to press 3, it's going to play back a sound file invalid. It's going to say, oh, I'm sorry, that's an invalid extension. Or I'm sorry, that input's invalid. And then it's going to use the go to go to extension S and my priority label here, or menu beginning. So it's going to route back up here and give them another shot. Later on, when we jump through here and I show you guys functions and conditional branching, I'll definitely want to get to the conditional routing. I'll show you guys how to create a loop, because you really, if somebody called into this IVR as it is configured, I don't recommend using it, because somebody can call in over your PRI and be stuck in an infinite loop. It'll never hang up on them, right? Because it'll just time out, it goes back to the beginning. It times out, it goes back to the beginning. It's going to be tying up your channel for that whole time, which if it's SIP, that's bandwidth being used. If it's your PRI, then it's a very precious channel being used. So later on, I'll show you how to essentially create a loop that says, well, only do it 3 times or 4 times or how many you want. And after that, then do something different, then hang up on them. The last thing I'll show you here is in our auto attendant menu, we want to give people the option to be able to enter the extension of the person they'd like to reach at any time. And the way we do that is via a context include. Okay? If you guys remember, I said contexts are separated by default. There's only a couple ways to get from one context to another. One is via a go-to, or like a go-to-if or a go-sub. Those kind of things will go to another Dialplan context. The other way to do it is via a context include. And, excuse me, the way I like to, the analogy I kind of like to use, which breaks down at some levels, but it's kind of like those Russian dolls, if you guys have ever seen that. There's typically a real big doll, and you open that up, and then there's a smaller doll, and you open that up, and then there's a smaller doll, and it keeps the small dolls are included inside of the big dolls. That's kind of how a context includes works, somewhat. I have a context here called phones. I'll hop back here. I have a context here called phones. And the phones context that's kind of would be like my internal underscore phones context. This has all of my dial plan logic to dial to my endpoints. And I don't want to have to duplicate that in two places. So let's say I have 100 endpoints. I don't want to have 100 extensions in my internal phones context and then have to port and copy all of that logic into my IVR just to allow people to dial them. I want to use a context include. The syntax is include equals greater than, and then the name of the context. And it'll take all of the extensions in that context and put them into the context that they're included in. So in this case, for example, let's say I have extension 600. Extension 600 dials my endpoint here, and it's in the phones context. So it's extension 600 at phones. That's the dial plan address for it. Because I've included phones in AA underscore menu, I can now dial 600 at AA underscore menu. So 600 is a part of that context now. It's been included in. That's how that works. OK, so the question is, does it matter where I included? Yes and no. So I typically, as a best practice, tend to include my context at the end. I like to do that, and it makes it nice and clear so I can find them easily. And towards that end, it doesn't matter. So if I put this statement, the include phones underscore phones, if I could put it at the top of the context, I could put it in the middle. It doesn't really matter. When it starts to matter is if you have multiple context includes, and if you have different which context is it going to hit first, right? So if you have multiple context includes and you have the same extension name in multiple contexts, then it's going to hit the first context that's included physically first.
If you're calling a context earlier, but it's not included until later, does that matter?
How do you mean?
If you're referring to a context in one of your go-tos, but that context is not actually included until later on in your include file, does that matter?
OK, so if I'm referring to, the question is if I'm using a go-to to go to another context, how does that impact the context include? And the answer is it actually doesn't. So if I'm using the go-to application, I don't need to include the context. I can go anywhere in the dial plan I want. So if I'm using the go-to application, I can just say go to context A, extension A, priority 5. And I can just go there. It doesn't need to be included.
That context is included in the include file, you include it after that command.
Right. So if that context happens to be included, so let me, I can show you guys my IVR here. And it's got a bit of additional logic, but I will, like I said, I'll go over it in a bit here. So the idea here is I have included my internal underscore phones context in there. So that means I can just dial the extension, but I could have an extension. I could say extend equals greater than 3, 1, go to, let's say 6 internal underscore phones, comma s, comma 1. And that's fine at all. These two declarations, this one here is completely independent of this one. It's not, one doesn't affect the logic of the other. So some alternate IVR approaches. Like I said, we could use the read application. The read application works similar to background in that it plays an audio file, but instead of routing to an extension in the current context, it writes that DTMF to a variable, and then you can route conditionally on that variable using goToIf. I'll show you guys goToIf in just a few moments here. Additionally, I could use text-to-speech. Kepstrel has some really nice text-to-speech software, and they've got this cool kind of thing that Allison has done, and where she's got like this database of proper names, and she's read like 1,000 different names. So when someone comes into your IVR, and you need to like read their name out of it, it'll actually be like read in the same IVR voice, and that's all kind of cool stuff. I think those guys will probably have a booth. You can stop by the Kepstrel booth and talk to them about text-to-speech. This way, when you call in, you could have text that then gets read out if you need to make, you can change it and such. And then we already talked about speech recognition via LumenVox or Vestec, are two companies that do that sort of thing. And like I said, I don't like to be partial. I will definitely like to tote Digium because I love this stuff. But I also like to say, hey, we're a community, and if somebody knows of other solutions, text-to-speech or speech recognition, let me know, and I'll add it to my slides. Let's talk about voicemail real quick. Voicemail is very simple to configure, and I'll just walk through the configuration briefly. There's basically 4 things that need to happen to configure voicemail in Asterisk. Or really, to configure any kind of voicemail. 4 steps for anybody needs for voicemail. Step 1, the user needs a voicemail box. Yes. Step 2, we need a way to send calls to that voicemail box. Step 3, we need a way to notify the user and tell them, hey, you have a voicemail in your voicemail box. And step 4, we need a way for the user to go and then get that message. Pretty simple to set up. First, let's set up the mailbox. We can do this in voicemail.conf. Configuration should look very, very familiar to us by now. We have a general section at the top. You can put general settings. There is a zone messages section. This would be where you can set different time zones, and you can look at the sample file. Look at voicemail.conf.sample in the configs subdirectory of the Asterisk source, and that will tell you all the options available there. And then at a very simple level, we configure a voicemail context. And it's very similar to a Dialplan context, but the difference is where a Dialplan context separates extensions, a voicemail context separates voicemail boxes. So here I have the default context, and this would kind of be like if I'm just using one. But if I had company A and company B, I could create 2 different voicemail contexts and put different voicemail boxes in each context. Here, it's very simple to declare a voicemail box. I just give the voicemail box a number. I give it a PIN number. In this case, I've chosen like 9999 as the default PIN. And then I give it a name. And that's a really basic configuration. Some additional options, you could put an email in there to email people their voicemail files. People love that. And Asterisk does that pretty close to out of the box with little configuration. And there's a whole bunch of other options you can tack on there. You can look in the sample file. But at a real basic level, we've got a mailbox, we've got a PIN number, and we stuck a name in there. That's for the sake of our directory. So if you guys remember the directory application, it looks at this file, and this is what it uses for the dial by name. Next up, let's send some calls. How are we going to do this? Via a Dialplan application. Just like everything else in the Dialplan, we create a priority within an extension, and we use an application. In this case, it's the voicemail application. So here, I have a context called phones, and I have extension 7001. At priority 1, it uses the dial application. It's going to dial SIP/01 Digium. So this is assuming I have a SIP peer or a SIP friend in SIP.conf called 01 Digium. And it's going to dial it for 20 seconds. That's a 20-second timeout. After 20 seconds, it's going to fall through to the next priority and call the voicemail application. And then this is going to route to voicemail 7001, which is, in this case, I've designed the voicemail box to match the extension number, which is kind of like a common practice. So there are more dynamic ways to do this. You can use variables and some other methods like that to get dynamic configuration so you don't have to hard code the voicemail box. But I'll show you that in a moment. At a basic level, to get a call into the voicemail box, you call the voicemail application. Next up, we need to send some WMI, or some MWI, some message waiting indication, which is like the red light that everybody loves on their phone. So the way you do this is by one declaration, and that's the mailbox declaration. So if you guys remember earlier, I showed you my sip.conf file, and I said, hey, I've got this mailbox declaration. That deals with voicemail, and I'll tell you about it later. Now it's later, and this is what does the message waiting indication. So what this essentially does is it tells the phone for that SIP account, you should send a SIP subscribe message for this mailbox, for mailbox 7001. That way, when Asterisk gets a message in that mailbox, it'll send you a SIP message and say, hey, you've got voicemail, and then that way you can turn your light on. what you should not confuse is the fact that the declaration is called Mailbox. It does not create that mailbox. The only thing that this option does is configure MWI, right? That's it. So you have to set up the mailbox in voicemail.conf, and then you use the excuse me, you use the mailbox option to configure message waiting. Lastly, we need a way to retrieve the message. This we're going to do, again, with a Dialplan application in voicemail.conf or in extensions.conf. So here I've configured extension 8002, and it goes to the voicemail main application. The difference between voicemail and voicemail main is that voicemail sends a voicemail into the voicemail box. That's for the caller. Voicemail main is for the user to dial in and retrieve that message. So when you can see here, I have not included any arguments. I basically am calling voicemail main and I haven't passed any arguments to it. That is, when you call voicemail main like that, it'll prompt you. So the first thing is it'll say, what does it say? It says extension or mailbox. What's your mailbox? So you put in 7001. And then it would say password, and you put in 9999. So it'll prompt you for those credentials. You can also create voicemail main to have a specific mailbox, and there's other options. You can do core show application voicemail main, or go to wiki.asterisk.org, look at the voicemail main documentation, and there's a lot of other features there. So that's basically it for the interactive dial plan.